Chapter 46. Storage Unit Shakedown. Baxter silently stewed in his seat after Roxanne walked away. He looked around, but for the most part people in the restaurant area went back to their own conversations, uninterested in the exchange between Roxanne and Baxter after Roxanne walked away. The cans on various tables glared back at Baxter. "I should go," Ruby said in her perky voice, jumping from the chair. "Call me if you want to make the deal." She flounced out of the restaurant. No one was sure if Baxter believed Ruby's ruse, or if he figured she was in on it. Nevertheless, she safely escaped while Baxter sat with beer suds stuck to his face and a shirt drenched with alcohol. With the first stage of their plan complete, they put phase 2 in motion. Even though they'd managed to agitate Baxter, they still needed him to lead them to his stockpile of stolen beer. After Ruby walked away, Baxter glared at Tom. Tom smiled back. He got up from the table he'd been sharing with Danny, and they both left, Baxter still staring. Tom and Danny met up with Roxanne at Tom's truck, Ruby having already driven off, her part complete. What Baxter couldn't tell is that Tom had spies, including Blake, planted in the restaurant, waiting for Baxter's next move. Baxter made a phone call and left the table, while one of the spies followed him. Baxter seemed tense, striding in a brisk pace to the parking lot. When he peeled out, one of Tom's spies tailed him. "You should be pretty good at this," Roxanne said to Tom as they waited in a parking garage nearby for the call as to what direction Baxter was headed. "Remember when you tailed me to the airport?" "What?" Danny asked. "Never mind," Roxanne said and smiled at Tom. When they got the call that Baxter was heading east, Tom pulled out of the garage and onto the road. Roxanne hoped Baxter was heading straight to where he'd hidden the beer cans. If not, they had wasted a lot of effort. Roxanne believed her plan would work because Baxter would be so shook up after seeing the identical cans, he'd want to check on his stash himself. She believed it was like the phenomenon that occurs when you see someone drop their keys and you immediately check your pocket or purse to make sure you have your own. Baxter couldn't bear to lose his stolen loot. Roxanne was sure of it. As they headed down the highway, she grew confident Baxter was leading them to the evidence of his wrongdoing. Tom received word from the man trailing Baxter that he'd pulled into a storage facility. Roxanne clapped with glee. She knew they must be getting close. They sped to the destination, and Roxanne called her father with the address. Through his buddy with the fire department who worked closely with the cops, her father had arranged for a detective and his partner to meet them at the scene. Despite having no real evidence, Roxanne's father convinced them to do him a favor and check out the unknown location solely based on a hunch. The dark sky made it hard to see the turn to the storage unit. Tom pulled in and Roxanne sat on the edge of her seat. Tom's informant had given directions on where to park, and then to approach the storage locker on foot. In Baxter turned violent or dangerous, Tom didn't want his spies approaching any further, wanting to confront Baxter himself. Once Tom stopped the car, he reached over to the glove compartment for a gun. "What are you doing with that?" Roxanne looked at Tom confused. "I didn't even know you had that." "Your dad gave it to me," Tom said. "Okay, but we're just here to gather evidence, get Baxter arrested," she said. "I know that." He seemed on edge. "It's just in case. Remember those goons and that gun to your head? I'm not taking any chances." He opened his door and so did Roxanne. As she made a move to get out, Tom rushed over and closed her door. "Not a chance," he said. "It's too dangerous. You're pregnant." Roxanne looked frustrated. She rubbed her stomach. Of course she loved her baby, but why did that mean she had to miss out on the action? Seeing Tom's stern face, she knew he was serious and she rolled her eyes, slumping on the seat. He gave her a kiss on the cheek and scampered into the darkness. Danny followed Tom as they slunk around a section of storage units. It reminded Roxanne of the first cat Tom saw by the dumpster, searching for food in the shadowy alleyway. She remembered how the cat had gotten spooked and skittered away. Unlike the cat, she had every confidence in Tom that he'd stand his ground. As Tom and Danny tiptoed closer, they could hear someone rummaging around in one of the units. They approached slowly, hiding in the shadows. Tom could see Baxter using his phone as a flashlight through the sliver of the door Baxter had left open. From his distance, Tom couldn't see exactly what was in the unit. Back in the truck, Roxanne sulked, wishing she could at least see what was going on. She remembered her stakeout with Tom and his binoculars, so she searched the truck, finally locating them under the seat. Being pregnant, it was almost impossible for her to slink unnoticed, but she tried, heading a few steps in the direction where Tom and Danny had disappeared into the night. When she heard voices, she stopped and inched forward. Around the corner, she looked through the binoculars and could see Tom and Danny getting closer. Unsure what to do, Tom stood at the entrance of the storage unit and yelled, "Stop what you're doing." Baxter turned toward him and lifted the door further. Tom couldn't quite see in the darkness what Baxter held in his hand, and Tom drew his gun. When Baxter chucked a beer can at him, Tom instinctively fired, the bullet bursting the can. "Hold your fire," came a voice from behind Tom and Danny. Two bright lights shined on Baxter as the detectives pointed their flashlights in his direction. Tom lowered his gun, placed it on the ground and raised his hands. Roxanne watched the standoff safely through her binoculars. When one of the detectives raised the storage door fully and shined their lights on its contents, Roxanne couldn't believe what was inside. Chapter 47 Runner in the Night. Baxter turned around, his eyes squinting in the lights. He looked out at the small crowd before him and his shoulders slumped. Behind him stood several dozen cases of clover leaf beer, but also flats of small potato chip bags stacked to the ceiling. In another corner sat rows and rows of barbecue sauce. Amidst the stacks, piles of money lined the walls, and barrels filled with bricks of plastic-covered white powder that Roxanne surmised were drugs, sat amongst the other loot. Roxanne, shocked to find such a varied assortment of goods, took in a deep breath. She felt glad they'd caught Baxter, but would it be enough? "Are you Baxter?" one of the detectives asked. Baxter dropped his head and nodded, hugging a small load of beer cans in his arms. He looked resigned to the fact that he'd been caught. "Where'd you get all this stuff?" the detective asked. "He stole it," Danny chimed in. "We told you he." "Let him answer." The detective held up his hand to stop Danny. Baxter looked into the bright glow of the flashlights. Everyone was quiet for a moment, waiting for Baxter to answer. Instead, he burst out of the storage facility and took off running. Surprised by Baxter's sudden burst of energy, it took a moment for Tom, Danny and the detectives to react. Tom picked up the gun on the ground, and the four of them started to chase Baxter, who began chucking cans at them as they ran. They were only a few steps behind him, but he proved fairly quick for a middle-aged man because they couldn't seem to catch up. From her perch, Roxanne sprang to action. She hustled back to the truck and driving toward the direction Baxter was running, planned to block off the alleyway with the truck. As she skidded around the corner, the truck careened into Baxter's path. He tried to run to the side, but Roxanne quickly threw open the driver's side door to stop him. Tom, not wanting Baxter to get away, fired a shot. Everyone froze. The sound of the bullet, the shattering glass and Roxanne's scream echoed in the blackness of the night. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He'd fired so instinctively, getting caught in the moment, but the sound of Roxanne's shriek sent a shiver down his spine that he might have missed and shot her instead. He'd been aiming at the window, wanting to slow down Baxter. He worried his split-second decision would end in tragedy. Tom sprinted to the other side of the truck and opened the door. Out of breath, he heaved out her name. "Roxanne," he said. "Roxanne, are you okay?" She sat behind the steering wheel, cradling her belly. "I'm fine. I think..." She winced and her face tightened. "I think it's the baby coming." Tom let out a long breath, relieved he hadn't shot her. He crawled into the cab and hugged her tightly. She looked at him, a mixture of both fear and relief releasing into a wry smile. "Nice shot," she said. "Yeah, my aim's gotten a lot better." He smirked, happy to be holding her. The door, in conjunction with the sudden shock from the bursting glass, had stopped Baxter in his tracks, enabling the detectives to catch up, each grabbing a hold of one of his arms. Danny stood back, letting the detectives handle Baxter. They watched as the detectives hauled Baxter back to their car. "I can explain. I'm a county permit official, for goodness sake. Those people," they heard Baxter say in the distance. "Those people are harassing me. They came to my country club and..." "And what?" asked the detective. Baxter pointed back at Tom. "He threatened me in front of my friends." "Who?" one of the detectives said, nodding, still keeping a tight grip on Baxter's arm. "That girl Roxanne. She's behind this," Baxter said as his voice started getting higher as he tried to protest. "She sprayed me with a beer can." "Did she now?" the other detective asked. "We have embarrassment in front of one's friends and a beer can spraying." "Marty," the detective glanced in the other detective's direction. "What crime do you think we could classify that as?" Realizing the detectives weren't taking him seriously, he tried to object. But, Baxter squirmed, but the detective's vice grip prevented him from freeing himself. "Just come with us so we can discuss this further," the detective said. After enduring another contraction, Roxanne slid over on the seat while Tom exited the truck and walked around to the driver's side. "Sorry, Danny," Tom said. "Looks like we're headed to the hospital. Can you order a ride and go to the police station to give a statement?" "Sure thing," Danny said. "And Tom, that was one crazy shot you pulled off." He shook his head with an expression of awe on his face. I had a great teacher, he said, smiling toward Roxanne. Tom sped along the highway, zigzagging through traffic to reach the hospital. He helped Roxanne shuffle in, stopping once along the way and grabbing onto Tom to stabilize herself while another contraction passed. Inside, the nurses checked Roxanne in, and she and Tom entered the delivery room. Tom adjusted her pillows, making sure Roxanne was as comfortable as possible. She beared down for a contraction before taking a seat on the bed. Seeing her act so brave and resourceful during the unexpected turn with Baxter made Tom love her even more. He stared at her in admiration for a second, knowing she'd be a smart and strong mother. What are you looking at? She asked. You, he said. Tom, now's not the time. She paused for a contraction. To be playing these games. I was just thinking about how amazing you are. Yeah. Get over here and rub my back, she said. Tom chuckled and took a seat behind her on the bed. With the next contraction he rubbed her back, and together they weathered the pain. It's coming, the baby's coming, Roxanne shouted after a few hours of enduring contractions that grew closer and closer together. Tom scurried into the hallway to find the doctor. Roxanne's nurse checked her dilation and agreed she was ready to push. Roxanne grunted with each contraction, concentrating on pushing through the pain. Tom held her leg, trying his best to help but feeling useless. He stayed quiet while the nurse and doctor gave Roxanne directions and cheered her on. After one last giant push, Eliza Jane was born. Tom had turned green, and Roxanne thought he might pass out. He stood as still as a statue, immobilized by the miracle of his new daughter. Roxanne experienced both relief and delight to have a healthy baby girl. She hoped Tom felt the same. Once the nurse cleaned Eliza up, she swaddled her in a blanket and handed her to Tom. Still standing stiffly rooted to the floor, he cradled Eliza in his arms. He looked down at her, then lifted his eyes to Roxanne. A grin as wide as the Nile flooded Tom's face with joy, and Roxanne's heart burst like fireworks of happiness at his reaction. Chapter 48. Unexpected Visitor. At home with their baby, Roxanne awoke to Eliza crying again. In her groggy state, she picked her up out of her crib and carried her to the rocker. Here, I'll get her, Tom said, bringing in a bottle. You go back to sleep. He kissed Roxanne's forehead, then the baby's. As Roxanne drifted back to sleep, she could hear Tom softly singing Eliza a lullaby. His deep voice crooned, comforting both Eliza and Roxanne. Tom had been such a great help the last few weeks feeding, rocking and changing Eliza. Roxanne thought about how lucky they were now that Baxter was behind bars. After their big bust with Baxter, the police discovered he had been extorting businesses all across Memphis. Owen was just one of about a dozen businesses Baxter had demanded bribes from in return for permits. If they didn't pay up, he'd steal some of their goods. In addition, he'd been working with a gang known for dealing in cocaine and counterfeit cash. Sometimes, the business owners would change their mind and give Baxter the bribe. Other times, something calamitous suddenly happened, like a burst pipe that ruined a bunch of inventory or an infiltration of insects that caused the health department to shut them down, or in Owen's case, a fire. The proof against Baxter, along with the permit he had signed, caused the city to drop their charges against Tom. They warned Tom that what he did was illegal, but based on the circumstances with Baxter, there was no need to further pursue the case. When Tom left for work, Roxanne got out of bed to dress herself and Eliza. She decided to take Eliza to the zoo, hoping for a nice, relaxing day with her little girl. By mid-morning, with the sun peeking through the clouds, Roxanne strolled by the panda enclosure, Eliza in her stroller, looking through the glass barricade. Roxanne marveled at two pandas sitting on the ground, eating crunchy bamboo by the handful. Passing by the giraffes, Roxanne angled Eliza's stroller to get a better view of the long-necked animals. They reminded Roxanne of Tom with their slow, deliberate movements and long, lean bodies. By the time they reached the tiger, striding back and forth along the grass, Eliza had fallen asleep. Roxanne watched the big cat, striped in orange and black, its muscles taut as it continued to pace. Exquisite creatures, aren't they? Said a voice behind Roxanne's shoulder. The hairs on her neck stood up at the realization of who had been speaking to her. She averted her gaze to the side to be sure she was correct and gripped the stroller tightly. What are you doing here? Roxanne asked. The bald man, one of her kidnappers, stood just inches away. Just enjoying the nice day. He looked up at the sky, cloudless with a vibrant blue color. Yeah, right. I don't believe that for a second. Tell me or I'll scream. The tiger gave a little grunt, still pacing, its agitation seeming to grow. Don't worry, he said. I'm not here to hurt you. Just a reminder. He flicked her hair. What now? Roxanne asked through gritted teeth. Your loan shark wants to make sure the groundbreaking is a success. Everything better go as planned.
No surprises.
He's agreed to hold off your repayment for a larger payout from this development plan, but it had better go though. It will, Roxanne said, her back to the bald man still watching the tiger. You might have gotten Baxter, but don't try anything with us. She turned to face him, a confused look on her face. Our arrangement has nothing to do with Baxter. The bald man laughed a maniacal little chuckle. He glanced around to make sure no one was paying attention. You don't know, do you? Know what? Roxanne shook her head. It was Baxter who rigged all the bets. The bald man walked forward, approaching the next tiger enclosure where a white Bengal laid on the ground and licked its paws. What do you mean? Roxanne followed, pushing the stroller. The bald man rapped his knuckles on the glass enclosure, trying to get the tiger's attention. He paid people to cheat so your father would lose. No, Roxanne shook her head. He couldn't have done that. My father made lots of bets. Baxter couldn't have. She stopped, trying to think more about what the bald man revealed. Your father didn't lose all the time. Just enough to get him hooked and coming back. The tiger yawned, his mouth revealing teeth like sharp daggers. But why? Roxanne asked. He was putting the screws to Owen. The bald man made a clawing gesture with his hand and released a little roar. When he refused to pay Baxter's bribe, Baxter exploited a weakness. Owen didn't have any vices, so he preyed on your dad. He looked in the enclosure. And like a tiger, he pounced. The bald man jumped toward Roxanne and she stepped back, startled. She furrowed her brows and frowned, thinking about why Owen had begged her father to stop gambling, insisting he couldn't help. When her father couldn't pay after one big bet, Owen set him up with the loan shark. Eliza started to fuss, and Roxanne jiggled the stroller, trying to get her to fall back asleep. Look, she said, pushing the stroller forward. Tom's project is going to be a big success. She pulled the stroller back. Tell your boss he'll get his money. The bald man walked away, and Roxanne tried to roll her shoulders back, ridding them of their tension. She took a few deep breaths and continued walking by the red pandas hidden in trees. Realizing her dad had been a pawn in a bigger scheme, made Roxanne sympathize with him. She knew it was easy to get sucked into the excitement of high-stakes drama, and she couldn't blame Owen for not cooperating with the dirty crook. No one had realized just what kind of trouble her father's deal with the loan shark would turn out to be. The mistakes everyone had made along the way proved calamitous, but somehow they brought Roxanne and Tom together. For that she couldn't be upset. Looking at Eliza, she felt thankful such intense circumstances had pushed them into a relationship. Meandering through the orangutan exhibit, Roxanne picked up Eliza and held her close. Even though she was upset after learning more about Baxter's duplicitous nature, Roxanne took comfort in the fact that the police had arrested him. Moreover, she was sure the loan shark would get his money back from the development deal, even though now she learned it was really Baxter who should pay the debt. As long as Tom's project was a success, everyone would profit, and she had faith Tom would create a vibrant and lucrative community. Downtown in a colorful, zoo-inspired cafe with murals of various animals on the walls, she met Tom for lunch in between some of his meetings. Tom cradled Eliza, kissing her face and playing peekaboo with the napkin. Even though he seemed to be enjoying their company, Roxanne could tell he was stressed. He sat a little hunched, his eyes a bit droopy as if he'd lost some sleep. Tom, what's up? It's this project. I really want to make it successful. It would be so good for the area, but I need community support for it. I want people to be enthusiastic about it so I can impress the investors. Otherwise, I'm afraid they'll pull out of the deal. Roxanne grabbed his hand across the table. I believe in you, she said. We'll make it happen, so don't worry. He rubbed his hand through his hair. Roxanne, this isn't something where we just need to chase people or shoot at things. I need a big show, lots of people, something that will gather interest. And I told you I've got it covered. She took Eliza and placed her back in her stroller. Tom forced a smile her way. How about your day? He asked, taking a bite of his sandwich. Oh, I had a little visitor, she said. Remember the bald guy you shot at during my kidnapping? Tom looked at her and swallowed slowly. Yeah. She nodded. Tom wiped his mouth with a napkin and slammed it down. When will this be over? He boomed. It was just a warning. Everything's fine. Roxanne put up her hands to indicate Tom didn't need to get upset. Like you said, we'll host a kick-ass groundbreaking ceremony, and your development project will be wildly successful. Then can we get some sleep? Tom asked, his shoulders slumping even further. Eliza started to cry. Someday, Roxanne said. Someday. Poor Tom, she thought. He had no idea that the surprise she had in store for him was sure to fix all his worries and earn him a good night's rest.
Chapter 49. Cat skradle.
In order to help Tom relax a little, Roxanne planned a special outing for the three of them. A special day with her two favorite people. Now that the issues with Baxter and the permit were behind them, they could concentrate on creating happy memories as a family. Following their morning routine of getting dressed and packing an enormous amount of stuff in a bag for the baby, they were off. You've been so helpful these last couple of weeks with Eliza. I want to do something special for you, Roxanne said as she drove them to a surprise destination. Once they arrived, Tom strapped on Eliza in a special baby carrier, and they entered the cafe. Inside, Tom's eyes widened. A dozen or so cats lounged around a cozy coffee shop. Surprise, Roxanne said, waving her hands. I know you like cats, but always felt like you were too busy to have one of your own, so I brought you here. A gray cat with puffy hair rubbed its head on Tom's pant leg. He knelt down to pet the cat's head, careful to protect Eliza in her pouch on his chest. They sat at a table and ordered coffee, watching the cats slink around the tables and chairs. One friendly yellow tabby scooched its way into Tom's lap and nuzzled itself against Eliza's back. Tom looked elated and at ease, watching the graceful felines and stroking their soft fur. Roxanne, being more of a dog person, watched Tom's eyes twinkle as he examined the cats. She knew he must be thinking about their balletic movements. Two cats in the corner started swatting at each other, and Tom laughed at their antics. When Eliza started to fuss, Tom handed her to Roxanne, who nursed her. Thanks for bringing me here, Tom said. I appreciate it. I needed a break from work. After all you've been doing, you deserve it. Roxanne gave Tom's hand a squeeze. Tom's phone rang. Hold on, I should take this, he said. Roxanne sat back with Eliza. I'm so sorry, he said. I have to go. It's just that we're supposed to break ground in a few days with the big groundbreaking ceremony, and I'm short-handed. Go, Roxanne waved him away. She tried her best to hide her disappointment. Tom ran his hand down the back of a wiry black cat before leaving the table and ordering a rideshare. Roxanne knew he had been working hard to keep his big development project on task in addition to helping with Eliza when he could. His plan included a suite of stores and restaurants with apartments above, along a beautifully manicured boulevard that allowed outdoor dining. The scheme also included several green spaces and a playground for the kids. By making such a project with commercial, recreational, and living space, Tom hoped to promote a family-friendly work environment that even the loan shark agreed could bring in big revenue. While Roxanne missed the construction industry, she had her hands full with Eliza and helping with the hole in the wall. Looking at her daughter, she was glad to be a mom, but she couldn't stop herself from trying to help Tom. Moreover, after her visit from the loan shark's goon, the success of the project seemed even more imperative. Roxanne was done with the drama, instead preferring to focus on her domestic responsibilities. With all the permits legally secured, Tom's next task was making sure he had the right equipment, supplies, and personnel for the job. Naturally, Roxanne called Danny. Hey Danny, my go-to guy, she said. Listen, Tom needs some assistance. You know about the groundbreaking ceremony, right? Well, do you think you could help? She wanted to make the ceremony a success and traveled to the edge of the city where Tom's first development project stood. With Eliza strapped in her baby carrier, Roxanne knocked on doors, talking to people about Tom's new project, and invited them to the groundbreaking. When a kid about 12 years old answered his door, Roxanne remembered meeting him on her date with Tom. Hi David, Roxanne said. Remember me? She asked, referring to the night of her kidnapping when David passed by and offered Tom a secret handshake. I remember you, but not the baby, he said. Yeah, she's new. Anyway, do you think you could help me with a little surprise for Tom? Tom? Tom, David's mother said from inside the kitchen. Anything. We'll do it, she said. Anything for Tom. Roxanne's final destination was a visit to her dad. By the time she walked in the door with Eliza, her back ached and her arms felt heavy, but seeing her dad's face light up when looking at Eliza lightened her spirit. Hi Pop, she said, kissing him on the cheek. He grabbed Eliza and stared into her big round eyes. She looks even more beautiful than before, he said. Are you going to say that every time? Roxanne asked, plopping on the couch. No, her father sat next to her. But she's just lovely. Such a cutie. I know. Roxanne leaned over and kissed one of Eliza's feet. She has Tom's hair but my eyes. The best of both worlds. Roxanne looked at her father with a slightly sad smile. What's with the sour face? He asked. I know you didn't mean to gamble all that money, she said. Of course not, but I did. He blew air on Eliza's belly, trying to get her to laugh. Roxanne shook her head and wiped some of her hair from her forehead.
No, Dad.
You were set up. What are you talking about? He asked, disbelieving. It was Baxter. Her father patted her arm. Look, Roxanne. I know you want to pin the blame on someone, but... Dad, I know. I heard it from a good source. His usual happy face turned serious. Listen, Roxanne. I don't know what you heard or who you heard it from, but I want you to drop it. Everything's fine now. You and Tom have a beautiful baby, and are developing a great piece of land. He smiled at Eliza. And you have a bar to oversee. He turned toward Roxanne and wagged his finger. Don't go looking for any more trouble. You've had enough. Just drop it. Despite being a mother herself, she still got scolded from her father. For years she'd been acting like the parent. In that moment, her father proved he still had both the authority and the wisdom. She realized he was right. She'd had enough drama. She ought to concentrate on her work and her family. I will, Dad. But first I need to ask you a favor. Shoot, he said. And that's how Roxanne set in motion her grand plan for the groundbreaking. With so many people taking part, there was a lot that could go wrong. But Roxanne knew that making Tom happy would be worth. Chapter 50. Unity Unearthed. The wind blew through the trees along the edge of Tom's development project site. Roxanne situated Eliza in her stroller and pushed her over the gravel drive to where Tom had set up 3 shovels, a microphone, and a portable speaker for the ceremony. Roxanne checked her watch. She hoped her surprise crew made their entrance at the designated time. So far, she and Tom were the only 2 there. She looked out over the several acres of land Tom bought from Ruby, and touched the Celtic knot necklace hanging from her neck. Tom stepped toward her and threaded his hand through hers. It's beautiful what you're doing, she said, continuing to stare into the horizon and imagine the buildings Tom planned to have built. I couldn't have done it without you. Tom tilted her chin and kissed her lightly on the mouth. We've been through so much together, and through it all you've been such a loyal, strong, and sexy woman. He kissed her again more passionately. I love you, he said. And I love our little girl. Roxanne smiled. I love her too. She glanced over at Eliza in the stroller. Tom looked at Roxanne expectantly. And you, she said after a second, laughing and falling into his arms for a hug. We've built a pretty awesome family. Now let's build an amazing community, Tom said, looking into Roxanne's eyes. They heard the rumbling of stones crunching under the wheels of several cars, as they approached the spot Tom had designated for the groundbreaking. Some of Tom's employees and other investors in the project started to arrive. When Roxanne's dad pulled up, she rushed over to him. Hi, Pop, glad you could make it. Sure, wouldn't miss it. She jumped up and wrapped her arms around him, hugging him intensely. What was that for? He asked. I guess I'm just filled with excitement today, she answered. Her father joined the other guests when Ruby arrived in a refreshing violet dress that flowed in the breeze. Hi, Ruby, Roxanne said. Tom walked over to join them and Ruby kissed them both on the cheek. This is going to be wonderful, y'all, she said. I know my daddy would be proud. We've ordered gooey, messy ribs to serve afterwards in his honor, Roxanne said. Ruby laughed and looked down at her dress. I guess I wore the right thing then. Tom's head turned when he heard the rumble of machinery approaching. Danny drove up to the site in an excavator, the engine roaring as he maneuvered the large power shovel to the designated area. He smiled and waved to the small crowd gathered as he cut the engine and hopped down from the cab. What's this? Tom asked, giving Danny a smile and a handshake. It's Roxanne's idea. She thought you might need a little extra oomph on your big day. He pointed to the shovels. Those are just for the pictures. That baby, he nodded toward the power shovel, is for the real work. Tom picked up Roxanne and twirled her around, laughing. Sneaky. How'd you keep this a secret? I have my ways, Roxanne said with a coy smile. Any more surprises? He asked. Just one, she said and looked at her watch again. A small cavalcade of pickup trucks thundered up the gravel drive, beeping, several people hollering from the back of the truck beds. Several residents and shop owners from Tom's first project sat in the trucks and waved to the crowd. Tom stood in awe at the parade of people who arrived to support him. They sprung off the trucks and joined the rest of the crowd. With so many people in the crowd along with the excavator, the show of support appeared overwhelming. Roxanne's dad approached Tom and handed him an old shovel. This was my granddad's, he said. We didn't have riches or fancy things, but we Garys know how to use our tools. I'd be honored if you used this at the ceremony. Tom held the shovel's rod in his hand and patted Roxanne's dad on the back. Thank you, Tom said. Roxanne's dad grabbed Tom and pulled him in for a hug. When everyone had gathered around the site, Tom held Eliza, as Roxanne picked up the microphone. Welcome everyone. I want to thank you all for coming. We're here today because of the vision of this amazing man. She rubbed Tom's shoulder. His projects make better communities. David can tell you more. Roxanne handed the microphone to David, who thanked Tom for helping him and his mom, providing assistance with their rent. Then a few more residents spoke, all providing glowing commendations for Tom. Roxanne held Tom's hand as several people from Tom's first development community provided short speeches. As they spoke, she could feel the vitality and excitement pulsing through his veins. Like the first time she touched his hand, his energy enlivened her. Despite revealing to her that he hated crowds and being around people in general, Roxanne could tell he was touched by hearing from so many people who supported him. When people were done with their speeches, Tom took the microphone to start the actual groundbreaking part of the ceremony. Knowing that Tom hated to speak in public, Roxanne figured he would just give a quick introduction before heading to the shovels for photo opportunities. Before we break ground on this exciting project, Tom announced, I want to thank you all for coming. He looked out over the crowd. This project would not be possible without one very special person. He turned toward Roxanne. Roxanne, I love you, he said. You and our daughter are the most important things in my life. I want everyone to know. He paused and smiled wide. I love this woman. She's the greatest thing to happen to me, he said, speaking loudly into the microphone. That's why I want to announce that I'm dedicating this project in her name. I've received official permission to name this boulevard Roxy Avenue. One of his associates handed Tom a green street sign with white lettering spelling out the name. Tom held it above his head for everyone to see. The group applauded. Roxanne wiped the corners of her eyes, trying not to cry in front of so many people. She hugged Tom and gave him a quick peck on the cheek. She felt flattered and impressed Tom had managed to arrange a surprise of his own, and one that showed her how much he loved her. With the sunlight starting to fade, Tom and the investors headed over to the shovels. News photographers and some people from the crowd snapped photos before they dipped their shovels into the ground. A minute or two later, Danny fired up the power shovel to give everyone a demonstration and make a bigger show of breaking ground. He drove the excavator up to the shoveled area and pulled the handles to direct the large shovel into the dirt. When he dug up the first bucketful, the crowd clapped. With the sea of happy faces supporting Tom and Roxanne, they beamed at Danny's display, maneuvering the excavator. Tom draped Roxanne's shoulder with his arm, while she held Eliza on her hip. Standing in front of the crowd watching their dream come true, Tom dropped his head a little to meet Roxanne's for a kiss. Her heart fluttered. Together, their happy family and their building project were off to a great start.